Hi everyone, my name is Sukaja. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be introducing you to my favorite poet of all time, Emily Dickinson. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. She is somebody that I was introduced to when I was just 12 years old, and I think there was an assignment in class where they asked us to go home, research a poem and record it and then bring it back to school. And I went home and I was just looking at the World Wide Web, which was a relatively new invention back in the day. The first poem I think that popped up in Google search was I'm Nobody by Emily Dickinson, and I'm Nobody is definitely one of my favorite poems, and it is something that resonated with me at that age. It goes something like this.
I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public like a frog. To tell your name the livelong day to an admiring bog.
When I was in school, there was this feeling that, you won't fit in. And I think I was in junior high or something. But that was the time when everyone felt like an outsider, and this poem just spoke to me because it felt like Emily knew exactly what I was going through. She was talking from an outsider's perspective herself. When she says that she's nobody, it felt like, there was a humble declaration to make. She's addressing a nobody as well. And Emily Dickinson is somebody who spent most of her life in isolation from the outside world. She didn't really step out into society. She didn't live as people lived back in the day. So she's an American poet born in Massachusetts in Boston in the 19th century, and her poems are written about a range of topics. Up until this point in school, we were just introduced to the canonical poets of British literature like Keats and Shelley and Yeats. So I didn't even know that American poetry existed until I was 12 years old, I think. But when I was introduced to Emily Dickinson, I realized that there is a different form out there of writing poetry. It's a very different style of writing, and that really opened my eyes to American literature and how liberating it can be. And then I discovered poets like Walt Whitman and Allen Ginsberg and the likes. As I went on to college, I studied all of these other poets, and I wrote a paper about Emily Dickinson's poetry, and I will link that in the description box if you would like to read it. This is about Emily Dickinson's philosophy of death. And the reason I wrote this is because at that point in my life, I was very curious about questions of death, because death seemed like this unknowable abstraction. And one of the best things about Emily's poems is that she makes the abstract seem more concrete by comparing it with material things, material objects and all of that. She writes several poems about death where she tries to personify death and she tries to understand it from a different level. Reading those poems really helped give me some insight into what I can expect. And she also talks about immortality and other things which are very interesting. Being an introvert myself, it was really nice to find a poet like Emily Dickinson, and knowing that she was very unconventional in her ways back in the day. She would write poems on tiny bits of paper, fold them up and literally throw them outside her window, and those were called envelope poems. And she totally wrote 1,800 poems. She was published only post her death, so she was posthumously published. She never saw fame in her life, which meant that she was doing this out of her own passion and interest. She wasn't somebody who wanted fame. Again, it goes back to the poem I'm Nobody, where the narrator is saying that she's not somebody who's going after the spotlight or wanting to be seen and admired by all. She's okay being behind the scenes, and she sees the value of being somebody who isn't very overt, who is actually very introverted and quiet, and she sees the value in that and being that sort of person. And I really like that about the poem as well. Some of her favorite poems about death that I absolutely love is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. This is one where Emily Dickinson, I think, talks about an out-of-body experience, just talking about being a dead body and hearing a fly buzz when she died. It's pretty cool. And the other poem that I liked is
Cause I could not stop for death, he gladly stopped for me.
This one is where death comes in a carriage, and he's a carriage driver, and he takes Emily away and into the unknown. Emily Dickinson suffered from disease the 2 years prior to her death. During that time, she had a lot of ideas, and that was a time which was very sad for her because she had lost her mom and she had also lost her sister, and all the people she knew suddenly started dying. That took a toll on her mental health as well. She's somebody who wrote about a bunch of things, and her work is very fascinating. I have actually read quite a few of her poems and would recommend that if you're someone who's new to poetry in general, I would suggest you start with Emily Dickinson because maybe it'll speak to you the way it spoke to me. What I'm trying to say is that I'm fascinated by this idea of the female poet of the 19th century who chose to wear white all the time. She was someone who had this tiny desk and she sat by her desk in front of the window in her Massachusetts home and she wrote poem after poem. She had a very interesting way of using punctuation. She was always using the dash, and I think today that dash is known as the M dash, and it takes after Emily Dickinson. She used a different unconventional style of punctuation with the dash. She could have chosen to use a comma to indicate pause, but she chose to use the dash instead. So I feel like Emily is someone who tried to be a rebel. She could have easily been like every other poet, and I think in her using the dash, it's kind of her trying to prevent readers from interpreting her poetry the way they would normally interpret it. It's just her way of adding a different spin. I really enjoyed reading her poems, and I would love to know if you've read any of them. Who is your favorite poet? Please share them in the comments below. I'd love to know. If you enjoyed this video, I will be back with interesting content. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sane. Also subscribe to my channel, and I will see you very soon. Bye!